Welcome to this week's UEN Capital Video Update. I'm Margaret Buckton, your UEN Executive Director. In today's video, we're going to talk about House action this week as the House passes the gun bill and the Masters Plus permanent license for educators. Committee action moves forward House File 1 property taxes and Senate Study Bill 1208, which cleans up some of the technicalities in the education savings account legislation. The Education's Appropriations has a focus on early childhood, what's next, and advocacy actions for the week. So floor debate in the House, and there was none in the Senate. So the House approved House File 672, which allows teachers with a master's degree or higher and at least 10 years of experience to renew their license without any continuation education units required. They still have to have a professional development plan in concert with their evaluator. It was approved by the House 98-0, now assigned to the Senate Ways and Means Committee, and we are registered in support. House File 654 allows people who are appropriately permitted to carry a gun to have a gun in their car on school property. And it has to be either in the driveways or the parking lots, and the car has to be locked if they're not in it. It applies to people while they're delivering or picking up students or materials to schools. It prohibits insurance companies from denying coverage based on guns in parking lots. They added as an amendment on the House floor a requirement for the Department of Education to create a model program of gun safety instruction. And it's based on the Eddie the Eagle Gun Safe program for grades kindergarten through 6 and through grades 7 through 12 based on the Hunter Safety course, both of those developed by the National Rifle Association. Now, it encourages school districts to offer an approved gun safety course to those earlier grades, K through 6, but requires one be offered in grades 7 through 12. It doesn't require students to take it. It also doesn't require a teaching license to teach it. Now, the course can be offered during school, after school, over the summer, or at school, private school, or other location. So even though these are model content areas created by the department, the district could offer different content if it's also approved. The bill was approved 62-37. It goes over to the Senate, and the Senate has passed an earlier version without the gun safety training component. We are registered opposed and in really good company. There were only 4 entities registered in support, and those opposed included not just schools, and schools weren't singled out, also community colleges, the Regents institutions. It's pretty amazing. That goes back over to the Senate. Committee work this week. Senate Study Bill 1208 is some cleanup language that would modify what was passed in the Education Savings Accounts legislation early in the session. It eliminates the public school requirement to provide textbooks to private schools. It would prohibit taxpayers from double dipping. They couldn't claim their education savings account payments for tuition and textbook tax credit purposes. It lowers the school tuition organization tax credit cap from $20 million statewide to $17 million next year, and that down to $14 million in fiscal 25, which still may be too high, as almost every student is going to be eligible for education savings account by that time. It does require any money remaining in an education savings account when a student withdraws from private school, is expelled, or does not re-enroll in the private school to be returned to the state. Now, during this subcommittee, we talked about amendments to allow some of the funds to go back to the public schools if the student wasn't counted on the prior October 1st count date. We also discussed a March 30th deadline to apply for an education savings account, so schools would have a little bit more advance notice about staffing requirements and budget. The subcommittee attendees also talked a lot about transportation assistance, which is provided by public schools. And it was suggested that the $9 million appropriation in the standings bill go directly to private schools and take public schools out of the claims processing role for parents. The subcommittee of Senators Conoyer, Dawson, and Winkler voted to move the bill forward with an amendment, but we don't know the details that they'll accept in the amendment yet. The next stop is the Senate Ways and Means Committee. And early Thursday morning, House File 1, property tax cuts, was on the House Ways and Means agenda to be amended and approved. The next stop there is the House calendar. Now, you remember this bill started with a requirement to have a 10% set aside before you run a bond issue, and to notify all property owners in the school district of the impact of that bond issue. And the amendment that was discussed is not yet available, so we'll share those details with you when we have them, but we believe those provisions were removed. Next stop is the House calendar. Hasn't gotten through a chamber yet, and the Senate's property tax proposal is still on the Senate calendar, Senate File 356, which phases out Pearl and affects valuation growth. they're very different from each other and would have a long way to go before they were implemented. The appropriations process, we shared this last week, and there's been no progress. All of these bills are in the Senate on the calendar as a shell bill with no numbers in them. We thought this week we would talk about the early childhood appropriations that are within the education approps bill. So that would include almost $26 million for early childhood Iowa. That's general aid, the special ed services, birth to 3, and early Head Start projects. And there's another 11 million that goes to early literacy for successful progression, early warning system in the Iowa Reading Research Center, and then a $10.5 million appropriation for child development. So as you're having conversations with legislators, you can talk about last week's focus, which was the mental health appropriations for students, and this week, early childhood. So what's next? There's been no action on several of the big bills still sitting out there. Senate File 496, the Governor's Transparency and Parents' Rights Bill, is in the Senate. Senate File 391, the Governor's Chapter 12 Flexibility, also in the Senate. And the House and Senate are in different places on many of the provisions of those bills. So we imagine those negotiations are ongoing behind the scenes. And of course, the education appropriations in the House haven't even started yet. So Senate File 560 is the only version in the Senate, and it has no numbers. Let us know if you hear anything from your representatives or senators that might inform our collective work. And the next deadline of importance is April 28th. That's the end of the per diem payments, and legislators like to be done by then. But this session could go into the middle of May, even later, by the time they get things all worked out. Advocacy actions. Focus on those things that are waiting in the wings. It's a good time to thank legislators on both sides of the aisle in both chambers for improving legislation working through the process. Encourage continued work on flexibility. When we're talking about appropriations, remind legislators about the high needs schools grants. That's $10 million in the budget that's typically pulled out during the standings appropriations bill, but they don't have to pull it out. And especially with all the changes impacting school districts, it would be a good year to make that commitment renewed. And then also how education appropriations bills, that bill provides supports and services for student mental health and early childhood. Make sure you mention poverty and preschool every time you communicate with them. We want to thank our UEN corporate sponsors. We appreciate their support and connection to our urban schools. Check out the corporate sponsorship page of our UEN website for more information about the services they can provide for you. And if you have a company or a service that you think would be supportive of our urban schools, please send them our way. Learn more by accessing the UEN legislative webpage. You can get issue briefs, legislative updates, links to these videos, calls to action, advocacy resources, and much more. And of course, look to your detailed report of things that are happening at the State House. Thanks for all you do to advocate for your students. We'll see you next week.